Hello. We are going to be continuing off with our civil rights talk, and we're going to be talking a little bit more, besides those major protests that we see, besides Washington, besides just talking about Rosa Parks and MLK. We're also going to be looking at other iconic figures that occurred during the civil rights movement, more particularly Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And so throughout a lot of history, throughout this current history that we see is that there's a splitting in how one goes for in getting the civil rights, right? And so MLK was very much of a it's portrayed more as a peaceful approach to everything, and slowly getting through this way. And then we see the split ideology of we shouldn't take it lying down is what occurs here. And so we see this rise of Black power, right? And we see Stokely's Camilla's definition as for Black power, it meant that African Americans should collectively use their economic and political muscle to gain equality. And it was very much like to fight against the institutional racism that was occurring in jobs, that was occurring in regular society. Like if we band it together, it will go and fight and work for us. And so this is where we start to see a little different fraction begin to form, particularly with Malcolm X. He was very much influenced by the race riots that he saw, and he was arrested. So while he was in jail, he actually converted to this religion called the Nation of Islam, right? He applied to the strict rules of behavior, no drugs or alcohol, and demanded a separation of the races. He calls for separation, i.e. for Black pride and self-dependence, and he preached for force, and if necessary, for violence as well. Right? And this is also what we see is this formation of the Black Panthers, right? And they're often portrayed to be very violent or anything, and what they started as is they started as patrols, right? The Black Panthers became a symbol for young militant African Americans. This is a group that many people joined, and what they did is that in urban neighborhoods they would patrol against their neighbors to protect the neighbors from police abuse. They're the ones who actually ended up creating anti-poverty programs, right? They created breakfast and lunch programs, and even created after-school and daycare programs. So they created after-school tutoring, after-school dinner, all this kind of stuff. And this later form was portrayed to be formed into a revolution group by Marxists, right? So these are the other form of protests we also begin to see. I talked about this briefly. And lunch counter centers, this is something that began with 4 Black students in North Carolina who sat down in a white diner and were told they would not be served. And this became a new thing that people began to do. It allowed students to become a new way to protest the segregation of public facilities, and they spread throughout the entire United States. It didn't just stay there. We also have the Little Rock Nine, right? Little Rock Nine, and this is where we start to see the unraveling of desegregation occur as well. The Little Rock Nine, what it did is were involved in a desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in 57, right? You have the Arkansas Governor overall Faubus. Please remember that name. It is important you remember this name. He will occur again and again throughout civil rights and on your EOC, right? So he is the one who prevented the students from entering the schools, from entering the racially segregated school, right? Segregationist councils threatened to hold protests at the school and physically block the students from entering the school. This led to President Eisenhower to send 1,000 members of the 101st Airborne National Guard to protect the students and to disperse the mob that was happening there. Right? So, of course, when we're talking about desegregation, you have to remember there is very much a lot of resistance occurring because of this at the time, and we're going to look at them. All right, so the first thing that we see occurring of this resistance is actually going to go ahead and be what is called the Southern Manifesto, right? And so what this was, it was signed by all three, by the following three Southern leaders. It was signed by Al Gore from senior Texas from Tennessee, Lyndon Johnson from Texas, and Estes Calfer from Tennessee. And what this called for resistance, and it appealed. Oh, sorry, I misread that. It was signed by all of the Southern leaders, but the following three. So these are the only three that did not sign it: Al Gore, Lyndon Johnson, and Estes Calfer. 2 from Tennessee, 1 from Texas. And what it did, it called for the appeal to the emotions of prejudice and paranoia, and it kind of became a united support of peaceful compliance that might have diluted the South, right? So it's basically like, don't let them desegregate, they're ruining our schools, our businesses, it's all this kind of stuff where they're not allowing for desegregation to happen. All right. And then we briefly talked about this in the last video, but the Freedom Riders, right? So the Freedom Riders, what they were, was that in 1961, you had black and white volunteers boarded 2 buses in Washington, D.C., and head south to New Orleans. Along the way, they were attacked in multiple points, most notably in South Carolina, where 2 members were beaten. Alabama, you had 3 attacks happen there. The first one was attacked by a mob. The tires were slashed, windows were broken. The second one was a firebomb, leading to them also being beaten outside. And the third, another bus was attacked as riders were hauled out and beaten as well. This had garnered a lot of media attention that reported the violence, and along this way, public simply began to grow for them. Newspapers around the world pointed out the contrast between American ideas and the spectacles that were happening both in Alabama and Mississippi. All right, the next one that we see, this is kind of a breakaway of what happens in nonviolence. And just to point out, we talked about this already in this previous video, letter from Birmingham. But these are images that actually occur in protests. You have protesters that are being hosed down or being attacked by dogs as well. Next we also see is along this way of desegregation, we also have the University of Alabama, where in June 1963, in order to prevent the integration of African Americans, you have Alabama Governor George Wallace, who stood in front of the doors to prevent 2 black students from registering. President Kennedy didn't have to use force and use federal troops to enforce the desegregation of the University of Alabama. And that is where we're going to be leaving off for today. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to email your teachers, and we'll be sure to help answer your questions. Thank you.